Jacob had it all. At least, that's what everyone around him thought. A successful business owner with a warm, charming personality, Jacob was the kind of man who made others feel at ease. He had married his college sweetheart, Emma, 10 years ago. Friends admired them as the power couple, two people who seemed destined for each other. Emma was stunning, with a graceful smile that captivated anyone who met her. She was the epitome of elegance, always supportive and kind, someone who charmed effortlessly. To the outside world, they seemed untouchable, flawless even. Together, they built a life that others could only dream of. They lived in a beautiful house that Jacob had worked tirelessly to buy, something he considered a symbol of their hard-earned success. Jacob's friends would often tell him how lucky he was, and he believed it. He adored Emma and was willing to do anything for her. But beneath the polished surface, Emma's true motives were carefully hidden, a side of her that Jacob was about to discover in the most unexpected way. It all started with small things. Emma became a little more distant, her phone always tucked away in her purse, her answers to his questions increasingly vague. Jacob, though not one to pry, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He wanted to believe it was just stress, or maybe a phase that would pass. But as days turned into weeks, her behavior grew stranger. He remembered one particular evening when Emma had gone out with friends. She came home late, a faint smile on her lips, yet she barely spoke to him. When he asked how her night was, she shrugged, saying it was just another night out. Jacob brushed it off, hoping he was overthinking things. But that night marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Emma's late nights became more frequent, and her demeanor became colder. Jacob felt a growing tension in the house, one he couldn't explain but could no longer ignore. Jacob tried to be patient, convincing himself that maybe he was imagining things. He'd been through stressful times before and knew how easy it was to let doubts fester. But no matter how hard he tried to shake off his worries, the distance between him and Emma grew more pronounced. One night, Jacob finally gathered the courage to ask her what was going on. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, and he reached out, resting a hand on hers. "Emma, is everything all right? You've seemed distracted lately. Is something on your mind?" She barely looked at him, pulling her hand away gently but firmly. "I'm fine, Jacob. Just tired," she replied. Her eyes glued to the TV, her tone clipped. He tried to accept her response, but it didn't sit right with him. For the next few weeks, he began to notice little things. She would slip out of the room to take phone calls, sometimes glancing at him suspiciously before lowering her voice. She started spending money on things she'd never shown an interest in before: designer clothes, high-end jewelry, even a new gym membership at an exclusive fitness club. Jacob rationalized it. She had every right to spend money as she pleased. They were financially stable, and he wanted her to be happy. Still, there was a shift he couldn't ignore. It was as if she was living a separate life, one that didn't include him. One evening, Jacob decided to test his gut instinct. When Emma announced she was going out to meet her friends, he casually asked, "Mind if I join you?" Her reaction was instant, a brief flash of irritation. "Jacob, it's just a girls' night. I think I deserve a little time to myself, don't you?" He nodded, hiding the hurt that flared inside him. "Of course, Emma. Just let me know if you need a ride home." As he watched her leave, dressed in a sleek outfit he'd never seen before, Jacob felt the first real pang of suspicion. As the weeks passed, Jacob couldn't let go of the uneasy feeling that gnawed at him. It was as though he was living with a stranger, someone who no longer looked at him with warmth but with impatience, as if he were an obstacle in her way. One morning, after Emma left for her supposed weekend retreat with friends, Jacob found himself in their empty home, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. It felt foolish to be suspicious of his own wife, but his gut told him he needed to find answers. He went into her office, a space he rarely ventured into, thinking perhaps he could uncover a reason for her distant behavior. Emma's desk was meticulously organized, but one drawer was locked. That struck him as odd, since they shared everything, or at least, he had thought they did. A rush of unease and curiosity pushed him to find the small key she kept in her jewelry box. When the drawer clicked open, Jacob's heart pounded. Inside was an assortment of documents, bank statements, credit card bills, and some contracts. As he scanned through the papers, his pulse quickened. Emma had been making large, frequent withdrawals from their joint savings account, amounts that far exceeded her personal expenses. Trips, expensive gifts, even several luxury items she'd never mentioned. There were receipts from fine dining establishments and hotels under her name, often while she'd claimed to be with friends. The most shocking discovery, however, was a credit card statement in his name that he'd never authorized. She was borrowing money under his credit, taking advantage of the excellent financial standing he'd worked so hard to achieve. Jacob's mind reeled. Was this what she had become? Was he just a financial safety net for her now? Unable to control the wave of anger surging through him, Jacob put everything back, locked the drawer, and sat down. The picture was starting to form. A dark, disturbing portrait of a woman he realized he barely knew anymore. That evening, Jacob lay awake, his mind turning over every detail. He couldn't confront Emma yet. He needed more evidence, something concrete that she couldn't dismiss or explain away. The nagging feeling that she was hiding something significant was now impossible to ignore. The next morning, Jacob decided to go through her car while she was out. If she truly was keeping secrets from him, he suspected he'd find something hidden where she thought he'd never look. Heart pounding, he carefully searched the glove compartment, the console, even beneath the seats. Just as he was about to give up, his hand brushed against something wedged behind the passenger seat. He pulled it out, a sleek, black phone that he didn't recognize. It was slightly scratched, like it had been shoved there in a hurry. His stomach twisted as he realized what this meant. Turning it on, he saw it was locked. He couldn't unlock it, but he noted the battery was nearly drained. Quickly, he took it inside, plugged it into charge, and waited. Several tense minutes passed, and then, buzz. A text notification flashed on the screen. "Are we still on for tonight? Same room as last time?" Jacob stared at the words, each one like a punch to his chest. He didn't recognize the number, but the implication was clear. Someone else was in his wife's life, and it wasn't just an innocent friendship. A sick feeling settled over him, an unsettling cocktail of anger and heartbreak. His hands shook as he placed the phone back exactly where he'd found it. Confronting her now would give her the chance to deny it, to lie. But his resolve was set. He would find the truth, and he would make sure she faced the consequences. The betrayal Jacob felt cut deeper with every new revelation. He had always believed that trust was the foundation of a strong marriage. Now, that foundation felt like it was crumbling beneath his feet, revealing a chasm filled with deception. But he knew he couldn't just burst out with accusations, not without a strategy. Confronting Emma impulsively would let her spin a story, deflect the blame, or maybe even twist the truth into something he couldn't untangle. No, he needed to stay calm, smart, and controlled if he was going to get to the bottom of this. That evening, he sat alone in his study, thinking of how to proceed. His instinct was to monitor her behavior, to follow her in secret if he had to, but that felt like something out of a detective novel. He'd read enough about how cheating spouses could slip away undetected if they were confronted too soon, leaving their partners with no closure, no answers, and no justice. Jacob was determined not to let that happen. As he thought through his options, Jacob remembered a close friend of his from college, Ethan, who had gone into private investigations. It felt surreal that he might have to actually hire someone to watch his own wife, but at this point, he needed the evidence. Trust was gone, and without it, he had nothing but suspicions and scattered clues. That wasn't enough. The next day, after Emma left the house, Jacob called Ethan. They hadn't spoken in a couple of years, but Ethan's cheerful tone quickly turned somber when Jacob explained the situation. "Jake, I'm so sorry you're going through this," Ethan said, his voice warm and steady. "I know it's not what anyone wants to hear, but you're not alone. A lot of people find themselves in this position, and it's hard to see clearly through the pain." Jacob appreciated Ethan's reassurance, but he was laser-focused on his goal. "Can you help me confirm it? I need to know the truth, Ethan. I need proof." There was a pause on the line, and then Ethan replied, "Absolutely. I'll be discreet. I'll put a tracker on her car and monitor any places she visits frequently. Give me any details you have so far, and we'll start with those. The call ended with a sense of determination settling over Jacob. He finally had a plan, something concrete to work toward. But as he sat there, his thoughts turned back to Emma. How could she betray him like this? She was the woman he had trusted with his dreams, his vulnerabilities, his love. And now, she seemed poised to strip him of everything he held dear. Over the next few days, Ethan kept Jacob updated. There were regular rendezvous at a boutique hotel on the other side of town, a place where she must have assumed no one would ever find her. There were records of her visits, almost every Friday evening, each time meeting with the same man, who, it turned out, was an executive at her gym. This knowledge tore at Jacob. Their relationship, everything they had built, suddenly felt tainted, hollow, as though he'd been living in a mirage crafted for his benefit while she pursued her own desires behind his back. But through the ache, he held firm to his plan. On the Friday of her next scheduled girls' night, Jacob called his lawyer. He'd been preparing for this moment, quietly gathering documents, statements, and everything he needed to ensure that, if and when the truth came out, he would be protected. And when Emma came home that evening, looking worn but content, he barely glanced at her. He knew everything he needed to know. Jacob's anger simmered as the days passed, but he kept his emotions locked down, waiting until he had everything he needed. Ethan sent him photos, texts, time-stamped records, all undeniable proof of Emma's affair with the gym executive. Each image felt like another wound, but he steeled himself, knowing that this hurt would fuel him when the time came to confront her. Finally, the day arrived. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when Jacob decided he'd had enough. Emma was in the kitchen, casually scrolling through her phone. She didn't seem to notice him at first, and when she looked up, her face bore a look of mild surprise. He knew she was expecting the warm, trusting husband who once would have done anything to please her. Instead, he was about to introduce her to a man she wouldn't recognize, a man she had shaped with her lies. "We need to talk, Emma," he said, his voice steady but ice-cold. She blinked, taken aback by his tone. "Okay," she replied, wariness flickering in her eyes. They moved into the living room, and Jacob gestured for her to sit down. Emma's eyes shifted as she lowered herself onto the couch, sensing the intensity of his gaze. She looked as though she was ready to dismiss his concerns, brush them off with her usual dismissive charm. But Jacob wasn't there to be swayed by empty words. He sat down opposite her, pulled out his phone, and opened the folder Ethan had shared with him. Without a word, he handed it to her. Emma's face blanched as she swiped through the photos, her hand starting to tremble. What is this, Jacob?" "You know exactly what this is," he replied, his voice eerily calm. "You lied to me, Emma. You went behind my back, took our money, and used me. And now, I have all the proof I need to end this charade." Emma's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to him, as if she could somehow escape the conversation entirely. Jacob didn't let her look away. "You told me those nights were just girls' nights," he continued, his tone growing sharper with each word. "You used me, Emma. Our home, our trust, our marriage. And all the while, you were planning a life behind my back, using everything I've built to fund your games." Her face crumpled, a mix of shame and panic. "Jacob, it wasn't like that. Please, you have to understand. I was unhappy. I felt trapped." Her voice broke, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. But Jacob didn't waver. He had heard every excuse in the book, read through all the painful details, and he was done giving her any more of his sympathy. "Trapped? You had every luxury, every ounce of trust one could give, and you chose to betray me." She reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled back, the rejection leaving her hand hanging in the space between them. Her tears grew thicker, her face red with desperation. "Jacob, please. I made a mistake. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We'll rebuild, I promise." He cut her off, his voice final. "No, Emma. There's no rebuilding after this. You wanted my money? Well, I've taken steps to make sure you'll get none of it. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm not giving you another chance to manipulate me." With that, he stood up, leaving her sitting on the couch, her pleas hanging in the air like faint echoes of the life they once shared. Jacob spent the next few days in a surreal haze. The confrontation had gone as expected, but the reality of Emma's betrayal hit harder now that he had made his choice. She was still in the house, walking on eggshells, her attempts to speak to him met with cold silence. She didn't have many options, and he was counting on that. Late one evening, Jacob sat alone in his study, going through the documents his lawyer had prepared. With the evidence of her affair, he had the upper hand in their divorce negotiations. But as he considered his options, he realized he could leverage even more. He wanted a clean break, but he wanted her to feel the weight of her decisions too. The next step was clear. He'd offer her a deal she couldn't refuse, but one that would leave her with far less than she might have hoped. The next morning, he asked her to join him in the study. She entered cautiously, her eyes red from sleepless nights and endless pleas that he had ignored. "Emma, I've decided to make you an offer," he began, his voice steady and firm. "You've already done enough damage to my life, so here's how we're going to handle this." She nodded, swallowing nervously, unsure of what he would say next. "I'll file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity. I have all the evidence, and with it, you're in no position to contest. But," he paused, watching her closely, "if you agree to waive any claim to our house, the cars, and the savings, I'll allow you a small financial settlement. Enough to keep you comfortable, but not enough for the life you're used to." Emma's face fell, and she shook her head. "Jacob, please, don't do this. I made a mistake. We can still try to work through it." He took a deep breath, tempering the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Emma, you didn't just make a mistake. You lied, manipulated, and betrayed me over and over. You spent our money, the life we built together, on some twisted fantasy. I'm done trying to understand. This is a clean break." She bit her lip, her hands clasped tightly together. "You're being too harsh. I'm sorry. I really am. I thought you'd understand that I was lonely, that I needed more. But you're acting like I'm some kind of criminal." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "You're not a criminal, Emma, but you're not the person I thought you were either. You were using me, playing me for a fool, and I don't owe you any more of my patience or my understanding. I'm offering you this settlement because I want you out of my life, but you don't deserve any of it." For a long moment, she didn't respond. He could see the internal struggle in her eyes, her pride warring with her desperation. She wanted to cling to the lifestyle she'd built, but she knew, deep down, she was cornered. "So, those are your terms?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I walk away with almost nothing?" "Yes," he replied, unyielding. "That's the deal. If you refuse, I'll take you to court, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why our marriage is ending." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, Jacob felt no sympathy. "I'll give you a few days to decide," he said, his voice cool. "But remember, every day you delay, I'll take it as a sign you want to go to court, and I have no problem doing that." He left her standing in the study, broken and silent. For once, he felt a strange peace. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but a sense of closure was beginning to take root. He had made his choice, and now it was up to her to face the consequences of her actions. The days stretched on, and Jacob maintained his distance, waiting for Emma's decision. He knew that her options were limited, but that didn't stop her from clinging to what little control she had. She spent most of her time locked away in the guest bedroom, emerging only to pick at meals in silence or try one last plea, her voice softer, more desperate with each attempt. But Jacob was resolute. Her apologies and excuses washed over him, hollow and meaningless, after the depth of betrayal he had endured. On the fourth day, she knocked softly on the door of his study. Jacob opened it to find Emma standing there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and her face bore the pale, haunted look of sleepless nights. The confident, graceful woman he had once loved now appeared worn down, every bit of her charm shattered. "Jacob, can we talk?" Her voice was barely a whisper, and he could see the fear flickering in her eyes. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair, her hands wringing together as she avoided his gaze. I've thought it over, she began, her voice quivering. I don't want to fight you, Jacob. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt you, in ways that I can't ever take back. She looked down, and he noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped her hands together. If this is the only way to end things, then I'll sign. Jacob felt a strange, bittersweet satisfaction. He'd expected her to resist, to drag this out, but there she was, accepting the terms that would strip her of the comfortable life she'd built on his trust. There was a part of him that almost felt sorry for her, but he forced it down. She had chosen this path, and now she had to walk it alone. He handed her the documents, watching as her trembling hands took them. "Read it carefully," he said, his voice steady but emotionless. "This settlement means you leave with a fraction of what you were planning to take from me. You'll have enough to start over, but not enough to live like you're accustomed to. I'm not doing this to punish you, Emma. I just want to reclaim my life." She looked up, her eyes filled with something almost like pleading. "Jacob, I know I don't deserve anything, but please believe me, I never meant for it to go this far. I was lost. I felt empty, and I thought that maybe having something for myself would make me feel alive again." Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. But Jacob felt unmoved. "You had a choice, Emma. You chose to betray me instead of talking to me, instead of working with me to find a solution together. Whatever emptiness you felt, you could have trusted me with it. Instead, you built a life of lies." She stared at him, defeated, and then signed her name on the documents, each stroke of the pen sealing her departure from his life. When she was done, she laid the pen down, her shoulders slumping in resignation. Jacob took the documents from her, his mind already shifting to what came next. "You'll have a month to pack your things and find a place," he said, his tone firm. "If you need anything in the meantime, let me know." Emma nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor. She stood to leave, but paused in the doorway, turning back to him with an expression that was hard to read. "For whatever it's worth, I did love you, Jacob. I lost sight of what mattered." He met her gaze, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything. Her words felt empty, a faint echo of the woman he had once known. As she walked away, Jacob felt a weight lift from his chest, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. She was finally gone, at least in spirit. All that remained now was the end of the formalities and the quiet rebuilding of a life he could once again call his own. With the divorce proceedings officially set in motion, Jacob felt the strange stillness that follows a storm. He hadn't anticipated how quiet his home would feel with Emma's departure looming, how empty it would seem even with all the furniture and belongings in place. Each evening brought the cold silence of a life suddenly stripped of the familiar. While Emma's presence had become painful, her absence left a different ache. Yet, it was a healing kind of emptiness, one that came with the knowledge that he could finally start anew. Emma moved her belongings out slowly, taking only what was specified in their agreement. Each time he watched her pack, she seemed like a stranger, a shadow of the woman he'd thought he knew. In a way, he realized, he was mourning her, mourning the version of her he had loved, who he now knew had only existed in his imagination. To ease his thoughts, he threw himself into his work, spending late hours at the office or bringing projects home. Every day, he felt himself moving forward, inch by inch, away from the pain of betrayal and closer to a new beginning. It wasn't long before friends and family began to notice the changes in Jacob's life. A few close friends cautiously approached him, their voices low with concern, sensing that something was wrong. He hesitated at first, but as the questions grew, he started to open up. Over a beer or a late-night coffee, he shared the outlines of what had happened, his anger simmering as he recounted the details. He had thought that talking about it might lessen the burden, but instead, it intensified his resolve. Surprisingly, as he shared his story, he found that many of his friends offered support, offering to help him through the process however he needed. And with every telling, he found himself feeling lighter. Slowly, his grief was starting to dissolve, leaving behind a foundation of resilience. With the divorce finalized, Jacob took time to consider what he wanted his life to look like moving forward. He made small but significant changes around the house, redecorating rooms, repainting walls, replacing furniture that Emma had picked out. Each adjustment was a step toward creating a space that was wholly his, a sanctuary free from the taint of betrayal. In his solitude, he rediscovered old hobbies he'd abandoned over the years: woodworking, photography, even hiking. Weekends became his time to explore, to venture out into the world without the constant undercurrent of suspicion or fear. It was as if he were reacquainting himself with life, with who he was before the marriage and betrayal had clouded everything. One evening, while out at a local cafe with friends, Jacob saw Emma across the room. She was sitting alone, looking down at her phone, her face wearing an expression of sadness. Her once confident demeanor seemed almost hollow. As she glanced up and noticed him, her expression shifted, a fleeting sadness crossing her features. She didn't approach him, and he made no move toward her. It was a moment of silent acknowledgement, both of them fully aware of the distance they had created, and perhaps both regretting it in their own ways. Seeing her now, Jacob felt no bitterness, only a quiet sense of finality. She was part of his past, but he was now firmly planted in his present. One afternoon while hiking, Jacob encountered a woman named Claire. She was vibrant, with an easy smile and a warmth that put him at ease almost immediately. They struck up a conversation, talking about everything from favorite trails to their views on life and love. She was refreshing, honest, and had a kindness that felt genuine. Over time, as they met up on trails and grabbed coffee, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Claire, like him, had been through a difficult relationship and was learning to rediscover herself. Together, they shared their stories, not dwelling on past pain, but instead discussing the lessons they'd learned. For the first time, Jacob felt that maybe he could trust someone again. As his relationship with Claire blossomed, Jacob felt the lingering shadows of his past with Emma begin to lift. He no longer found himself haunted by memories of betrayal or weighed down by what had been. One evening, he took all the documents, the photos, and the evidence he'd collected during the divorce and burned them in his backyard. The flames were small, but symbolic. Watching the embers drift into the night sky, he felt a profound sense of release. Claire watched from the doorway, understanding without words what this ritual meant to him. When the fire burned out, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. Jacob realized that, finally, he was free. Months passed, and Jacob's life felt transformed. He and Claire grew closer, their relationship built on mutual respect, honesty, and a deep sense of understanding. He took things slowly, cherishing each moment and appreciating the journey he had taken to get here. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Claire took his hand, her gaze warm and steady. "You know, Jacob, I think you've shown me that love can be rebuilt, that trust is possible again." He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I didn't think I'd find this either," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I think sometimes we have to let go of what we thought we wanted to make room for what we deserve." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, both of them content in the quiet certainty that the past was behind them and the future lay ahead, open and full of promise.